Okay. The first question is, I've seen videos that claim crop circles contain blueprints to some unknown technologies. What can you say about messages from crop circles?
That's a great question. And, there's so many sections of this story. And as most of you know, Colin Andrews and I have been very good friends since the early 90s. And I started going over to the crop circles in 1992. And while many people have said that this is part of a sort of a technological expose, I have no knowledge that that's the case. What I do know is that experiencing the real crop circles as opposed to man-made ones, which increasingly many of them are man-made, they have a sort of archetype effect within the structure of consciousness. And what I mean by that is that it's not a linear language like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, or a language like Sumerian. It's more like a mandala, if you understand what a mandala is in the ancient Vedic concept, a design that has an effect in awareness, but a very specific one. And I think that there are sacred geometric forms that may and do, in fact, have technological implications, but it's not as literal as people have wanted to make. It's actually an awakening in consciousness at a deep archetype level. And, if you understand the Vedic sciences, consciousness is an omnipresent, non-local field of awareness. Within that, at a very, very fine level, there's a level called Ritambara Pragya, and that's a Sanskrit word, Ritam, for a fine level of consciousness, just this side of the unbounded component that's in the relative, but where knowledge and forms and sciences and art exist in a pre-existent state, but that can be experienced by consciousness. What I think is happening with the authentic crop circles is that it's reaching into a very deep level of that structure in consciousness and enlivening it. And I think that that's a very, I know many people would not have that perspective, but that's just our own experience from having been in these crop circles for 20 years and done contact work. And as most of you know, in 1992, the CSETI logo, which is an equilateral triangle consisting of three circles connected by lines, that was actually a contact event where we visualized that form. If you go to cseti.org, you'll see it in kind of three dimensions. And we visualized that and contacted the ETs and asked them to create a crop circle that would look like that form. No one in the world knew that form until we actually arrived there on Woodborough Hill in Alton Barnes that night, because we had not even decided what we were going to project mentally through mental imaging to the ETs. The next morning, a farmer found exactly what we had visualized and sent to the ETs in a field. And it's interesting because back then there was a group being funded by Robert Bigelow, the Bigelow Aerospace, that was looking into crop circles and doing various studies. And I was told by people, scientists on that team, that the anomalies found within that particular crop circle were the most authentic of that year. But because it was a CSETI CE5, it was sanitized out of the report for 1992. So there's always a cover-up to the truth. And that's what happened. And that was the same year where in a field just a few feet from where we made this contact and visualized and asked the crop circle makers, if you want to call them that, these trans-dimensional ET beings, to make this crop circle that's now the CSETI logo, where we continued these protocols and then had about 100-foot diameter disc float into the field in the mist. And so that, of course, is ancient history. But ultimately, the events, the CSETI CE5 events that happened near Pensacola, Florida in 1992, the contact that happened in Belgium in 91, the events that happened last week on Mount Shasta, which we actually filmed, with these luminous objects coming out of the volcano of Mount Shasta, and other events that were directly overhead. We had 360 high-resolution filming going on the entire time we were out there. Some of these are going to make their way into the serious film, and it's not going to be what people expect. It's quite extraordinary, because when you have to understand that if you can go from the Andromeda galaxy to here, which one of these civilizations we've had contact is from there, you're 2.5 million light years from the Milky Way if you're from Andromeda. Well, that's the distance that a beam of light goes at 186,000 miles a second for 2.5 million years. So at the speed of light, it would take you 2.5 million years to get to Andromeda and 2.5 million years to get back. That's 5 million years. Nobody lives 5 million years. I don't care. Ain't Moses, nobody. So basically, even in our own Milky Way, which is 100,000 light years across, 1% of the way across the Milky Way is 1,000 years, 1,000 light years. So it would take 1,000 years to get there at the speed of light, which is much faster than the space shuttle or this Curiosity thing we just put on the Mars surface, and another 1,000 years to get back. And that's only 1% of the way across our Milky Way galaxy. What that means is that even in our galactic neighborhood, never mind other galaxies, the speed of light is just way too slow. And so when you start talking about very high voltage systems that enable a spacecraft and its occupants to drop out of linear space-time, they have to go interdimensional or transdimensional. But so do their communication systems, which means they're interfacing with the visual component of thought, which many of the mystics in the old days would call astral. So when you guys have a flying lucid dream, guess what? You're about in the same dimension as an ET vehicle is when it's hovering dematerialized in the atmosphere or in your backyard or going from Andromeda to the Milky Way and back. And so this has got to get understood. One of the problems in the whole UFO subculture is that people are still running around wanting to kick the tires when we should be 50, 60 years into understanding an entirely new paradigm of a quantum conscious holographic universe. And this is where the work of Goswami and people like Larry Dossey and people like Dr. John, who ran the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the Peer Lab, who I spoke with personally when he was still living, and people like Bruce Lipton and Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about morphogenic fields. This is where that work meets interstellar transdimensional. And that understanding and our contact work is going to be the sort of finale of the film series, because we want to live people with a vision of not only humans making contact, but eventually traveling amongst the stars in peace, but also advancing in higher states of consciousness, without which we cannot even bring these technologies out. Because if we bring these technologies out with the consciousness of division and what happened at the Sikh temple and what's happening now all over the world with warfare and racism and homophobia and gay bashing and bullying and warfare after warfare, those technologies will only do more damage. Even though they don't pollute, they can be weaponized. And I remember recently having a conversation with a colonel at the Air Force who was in charge of, and get this euphemism, a wonderful, future technologies for the Air Force. That was his title. And this colonel had the conversation with me and said, look, you know, these sciences and technologies can be weaponized. I said, yes, and I all but said, you bastards have already done that. That's what you're using in these classified weapon systems to target and shoot down extraterrestrial vehicles. And I said, however, if we don't bring them out, we're going to destroy the biosphere with 7 billion people using fossil fuels. If we do bring them out and we don't have a complete change in our consciousness that's based on universal principles, peace, and using these technologies for the good of the human race and not for militarism, then we're also sunk. So we're at the horns of a dilemma, the biggest dilemma humanity's been in. It's an existential crisis in the truest sense of the word. And that's why this film has to convey this existential crisis, but in a way that presents not just the problem, but the solutions. And part of the solution is this understanding of consciousness on higher states of consciousness and what the message is that's within the crop circles about the nature of mind and space and time.